Good evening. My name is Cynthia Weems.
And I'm Derek Scott III. We are co-conveners of UMCNEXT, a collaborative group of clergy and laity across the United Methodist Church that is seeking to point our denomination towards the future.
This future is joy-filled, gospel-centered, faithful, and inclusive of all of God's creation. Thank you for joining us tonight for this third in a series of roundtable conversations leading up to General Conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, to begin in late April. Tonight's theme is the church we dream of, legislation that gets us there.
And I'm really excited about our panel tonight. Some really incredible folks are going to give voice to these topics. So I want to go to invite our friends onto the stage, Judy and Caleb, Molly, Lydia, and Lonnie.
Thanks to our panelists for being here this evening. We're so glad you're here. I'm going to offer brief introductions for each of you. Judy Keniston is Chief Connectional Ministries Officer for the Connectional Table and a lay delegate from the West Virginia Conference. Caleb Parker is a steering committee member of the Queer Delegate Caucus and a lay delegate from the North Carolina Conference. Molly Vetter is Senior Pastor of Westwood United Methodist Church in Los Angeles and a clergy delegate from the California Pacific Conference. Lydia Munoz is the Executive Director of the National Plan for Hispanic and Latino Ministries and a clergy delegate from the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference. And Lonnie Chafin is the Treasurer and Director of Administrative Services of the New York Annual Conference and a lay delegate from the Northern Illinois Conference. Derek, you'll be the moderator for this evening's roundtable. My colleague, Derek Scott III, is a lay delegate from the Florida Conference, and he is the co-lay leader of that annual conference. Tonight's roundtable is going to be fantastic, Derek. Thank you for moderating this evening. I'll be behind the scenes, so take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Cynthia. Really grateful for you. And again, grateful for our panel and all those who are watching, whether it's live or later on in the week. So we're in this conversation, particularly about the church that we dream of. And there's so much going on. There's so many things pulling at us, definitely in our church, but also in the world and in our own lives. It's good for us, I believe, to really begin to hone in on the reasons why we have hope for the church and the vision that we believe God is giving us for the future of the church. You know, when I think of the church that I dream of, when I think about a church that's making room for the next generation. I've been in campus ministry 20 plus years. I'm always thinking about college-age young adults and how they fit into the work of the church. But I also think about laity, and I think about individuals in the pews within our congregations who have a voice and have gifts to bring to the table. And I'm grateful for clergy, but the church I dream of is a church that continues to make room for the gifts, the graces of laity. And I'll just say that I also dream of a church who has a strong polity, but the polity is responsive to the lived experiences and realities of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the world that we're in. And so that, that might be a high bar, some of these things, but that's the kind of church that I dream of. And as we're getting started tonight, we're going to talk about legislation specifically, but I'd love to hear from the panel tonight. Just really quickly, can you describe for us the church that you dream of? Let's start with you, Molly.
Thanks, Derek. And I want to just echo what I just heard you say there, and that is to start with an acknowledgement that the general church is not the church, that our institutional church and this particular ordering assembly hopefully is functioning to enable and expand the witness of the church and the love of Jesus Christ through the United Methodist Church's institution. But legislation can't get us there alone. It's a lived and embodied experience. And also, we have learned that the General Conference can't prevent the church from moving forward, even though in 2019, in many ways, the General Conference approved legislative proposals that made us a more exclusionary body. The church, especially in the US, has moved forward as an embodiment of a different spirit of expansive inclusion. As a local church pastor, for me, the church that I dream of is this work of embodying and practicing the love of God in communities. It's the church that raised me as a kid in central Nebraska, that taught me that the church was a place where I knew that I belonged and was beloved, where I had something to do and a part to play in a work that extends me beyond myself, that puts me not only in relationship with people who are different from me, but expects that I will learn from and see God in the rich diversity of the church, so that we can be a witness for the sake of the transformation of the world. And God knows there's plenty of work to do as we face the intractable problems of the world, climate disaster and white supremacy, and the realities of navigating the systems and oppressions of our time. So I dream of a church that equips us and empowers us for that work.
It's beautiful. Thank you for that, Molly. Lydia, tell us a little bit about the church that you dream of.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here tonight. So for me, I think I dream of a church that is daring enough to ask the question. And the question is this: where does it hurt? And what does God have to say about it? And that for me, it sounds simplistic, but it's actually not. I learned that question from Mama Ruby Sales, who taught a lot of us on the journey of what it means to be people who really work for justice, right? To really ask the question about where it hurts. And I dream of a church that is willing to do that, to dare to do that, to shape itself around that question, to center itself around that question, and to be able to speak with bold, prophetic, and reimagination of the future and the present and the reality that God wants to respond to. So that's what I dream of.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that, Lydia. So powerful. Lonnie, so glad to have you with us tonight, my friend. Could
Well,
you
it's a
tell us a
steamed
little?
panel. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about the church you dream of.
You know, I'm ready for the next expression of Methodism. I think there's a way of doing church that is beyond the congregation-based uh, that we need to continue to support. But I'm encouraged by the experimentation and innovation that we're seeing of folks finding new ways of creating church that could be ad hoc communities that are temporal, or that they are expressing themselves and finding ways in which discipleship can happen online or in virtual spaces. So I'm excited about all the experimentation that's happening throughout the denomination. I'm happy that it is not channeled, it is kind of ground up. And I long for a church that can identify those things, get behind them, multiply them when they work. Because I think there are new formats of church that happen among the digital natives, new ways of creating holy community with folks who live in that type of environment. And so I look forward to this experimentation and getting behind it and crafting a new way of worshiping and witnessing and experiencing discipleship.
That's exciting. That's really exciting. Thank you for that, Lonnie. Caleb, really glad that you're with us tonight. Would love to hear about the church that you dream of.
Thanks, Derek. I was wrestling with this, and I loved the way Lydia put it, with a bold expression that is prophetic and imaginative. And when I look at where I want us to go, where I want us to be, is in that prophetic sphere where we focus less on keeping the center centered and happy and more stretching out into the margins. And that is the work of justice. So I would love for us to be faithful, justice-seeking, justice-oriented church, and the work towards reconciliation with those who have, where does it hurt? For those who have been harmed, for us who have been harmed, for queer folks. Where does that work happen? It doesn't happen just by removing the harmful language and then we've done the work. That's the start of the work. The next position is then to educate ourselves, lament how we've been part of this process, confess it, and then we're on the track of reconciliation and trust building. That's the bold, hard work that we are ready for. Many of us have been doing this in so many ways. I look forward to being a part of that, and I hope that GC24 can help get us there.
So great. Thank you, Caleb. Judy, we'd love to bring you up on stage and hear a little bit about the church that you dream of.
Thank you. And the joy of going last after hearing these wonderful ideas, and I'm feeling very inspired. So thank you for all of you. Thank you for having me. The church that I dream of maintains our connection to one another while recognizing that we have different gifts, all of which contribute to God's work that we have before us in this world. You'll appreciate this, Derek, but as a young person, determining if my upbringing in the United Methodist Church reflected the way that I wanted to live out my faith in the world, I found a home in campus ministry, in United Methodist campus ministry, and a campus pastor who acknowledged my questions, my doubts, and my hopes. And I learned of what the United Methodist Church was doing around the world and outside of my little local church. I loved being part of something bigger than I was. And the connection was how I was able to live out my faith. And so the church that I dream of is connected. We use the best of what we do and we share it among all the congregations using the structure that conferences provide. And this means the work of agencies, the work of the episcopacy, and the racial and ethnic work that we do is available to all. But the church also needs to provide agency, which allows us to recognize our contextual needs. And we aren't all the same, and our mission fields differ. So we have to allow for the freedom, the encouragement, the resources to minister to those who are in front of us. And those two strains live in a tension. Can the ties that bind us together be flexible enough to allow us the freedom to minister as God leads us? This is what I want this dream church to discover. That place where we can rejoice and celebrate our connection and our context. Those together.
Oh, that's great, Judy. And yes, you got me at campus ministry. You definitely had me at campus ministry. Oh, so grateful to have all of you here tonight. I think we're going to have an incredible conversation, and we're going to just go right into the theme for tonight around legislation. You know, we've got General Conference coming up. We've been anticipating this General Conference for many, many reasons. And we all acknowledge that legislation is not the thing that gets us to the church we dream of, but it is a part of it. And taking this work of Holy Conference seriously. And so I'd love for us to just kind of go around the room and to talk about the piece or pieces of legislation that you believe will help us move closer to being that church that we dream of. Again, one of a larger piece, I'm sure, but the legislation that really helped us get there. And I just want to invite us tonight. It's okay if we get a little metho nerdy in the space, maybe not like giving us the address of the ADCA. That might be a little too metho nerdy, but I just invite us to go. Let's go in and really have a good discussion around the legislation because it is important, and I think folks will be helped by it. So, Caleb, I'd love to start with you. Talk to us about the legislation that you believe is really going to help us be that church, become that church that we dream of.
Yeah. So, queer people are watching GC24 like never before. This is a really big moment in the church for us to do a thing we've been trying to do, and allies have been trying to do for decades, which is get rid of the harmful language that harms queer people. There's quite a bit of that legislation out there that's trying to overturn that. But the one thing I want to focus on is something in the social principles. It's in paragraph 161G. And it says that homosexuals no less than heterosexuals are of sacred worth, but that homosexuality, the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. That has been used time and time again consistently to bash us. And I think it's one of the most toxic pieces of language that we see. And I think that for the first time in a long time, we have the real ability to remove this language, and that is through adoption of these beautifully revised social principles, because it sits within the social principles. The Church and Board of Church and Society, along with over 4,000 people, have been a part of revising these for, 12 years now. And they are imperfect and they are beautiful. And it gets us so much further as a church, and especially in the work that we do with queer folks. So I'm fully supporting the revised social principle, honoring the work that so many people from across the entire connection put into creating. I think that is a piece of legislation that definitely gets us further.
Oh, thank you for that, Caleb. Giving us the address. I love it. So grateful for that thought. And I, as a gay man, I am looking forward to the day that I can look at the Book of Discipline and not be worried about its impact on me in that way that the harmful language is talking about me. So I want to thank you for lifting that up, Caleb. Lydia, talk to us about the legislation that helps us get to being the church that we dream of.
Yeah, I want to echo Caleb's words and lifting up that that piece of legislation. That's actually, there's several different ones that are connected to that. So it's important to kind of look to see where all those connections are, so that we're making sure that we're really spanning all of that. Because I always remind people that we can remove the harmful language but still keep the harm. So we want to make sure that we're like really intentional about that in all kinds of places. And for me, legislation that or pieces of there's so much, but there's pieces of legislation that I want to lift up, and that is, not just because I'm the executive director of one of the 6 ethic plans that as delegates we have voted into, but oftentimes I think we, just like everything else, we enter into general conference, we vote things in, and then we completely, if it's not directly, or we think it's not directly impacting my local congregation or my place of ministry, we kind of forget about it, right? It's like out of sight, out of mind. And so I think it's really important that if we are going to work towards a new expression of United Methodism, right, that we really focus on centering what, we probably need to spend several general conferences answering the question, what does full inclusion mean? What does it mean to be a fully inclusive church of all people? Because that's going to be hard for us to continue to live into, right? And that's okay, because we believe that we're moving on into perfection. And so every little step, sound like the boys team. Anyways, so I think that those pieces of legislation, ones centered around our agencies that are connected to, like GCOSRO and the General Commission on Religion and Race, those pieces of legislation are helping us understand what full inclusion is. And the last General Conference, we passed legislation that affirmed women in all areas of ministry, but then we didn't get it ratified. And that was like, really, it was no bueno. So, yeah.
Lydia, I really appreciate you bringing up a couple of things. One, that this work, even with legislation for General Conference 2024, it's not like we get done with whatever happens in 2024 and we've done it. Like, okay, church is good now. No, like this is a continued work on maybe even legislative perfection, if we could say it that way, right? Like, but that there's this sense that we are always on this journey as a church together. And so I appreciate you bringing it up, that this is being inclusive is a conversation we have to have for a while, if we're serious about it. And I also appreciate you lifting up the piece of legislation from our agencies who are trying to bring the voice from the margins into the center. And so really grateful for you lifting up those pieces. Lonnie, would love to hear from you. What's the legislation that you believe will help us get to the church that we dream of?
Well, I like picking up this thread that you all have laid down around thinking of multiple general conference work. I'm excited by one of the UMCNEXT proposals, which is create a commission for a 21st century church. I feel like the challenge in 1967, when the United Methodist Church was formed, was really around merging two denominations. And we've lived for 50 years with that structure, and there's a new 50 years ahead of us. It's time to reboot the structure and think through all the dynamics of what it takes to be a less colonial constitution, a more effective general witness, how we can be flatter and more nimble and more adaptive and more contextually relevant. All of these questions lie before us and require, and anyone who's tried to change the structure knows, inevitably there's some barrier that you run against. And so I'm excited about this commission for the 21st century church, which would create a group of people who would be in conversation with everyone, as I imagine it. It would be all of us would find a way to participate into this, but that they would come to the 2026 special session with a new denominational structure that can meet and be tooled for the realities of our present and what we need to do going forward. And so I really like this idea that the delegates, through this work of creating this Commission on 21st Century Church, could really program what happens at the 2026 special session. It's for us to kind of grab the wheel of the car and set a course that builds the church we hope to be, right? Builds the platform for us to do the witness we hope to do for the next 50 years. So I'm really behind this Commission for the 21st Century Church petition.
I love that. And I appreciate you lifting that piece up, Lonnie. You know, I think similarly with the revised social principles, like we needed a full revision, not just amendments here and there, but we actually need to look at the whole and ask some questions like, do we have everybody at the table in how we are envisioning this? And are we living in the reality of the world that currently exists? And so I think that you're right. I think that that is a piece that really would help us become that church that we dream of. One piece of it, at least. Molly, would love to hear. No, I'm sorry, not Molly just yet. Sorry. My bad. Judy, I'd love to get you up on the stage. Definitely want to hear about legislation. You've been deep in a lot of legislative work, so would love to hear about legislation you believe helped us get to the church we dream of.
Great, thank you. I'm going to highlight a few things. One, I believe we will be covering more extensively in a few minutes, and that is regionalization. There are several pieces of regionalization legislation, but I believe that most delegates are focusing on the legislation that was brought by the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, which encompasses both the original U.S. as a regional conference legislation, which was proposed by the connectional table, and also the work that has been done throughout the denomination by the Christmas Covenant. That legislation is being called the worldwide regionalization. And I believe that the original need for the U.S. to do the adaptable work that still exists, then it is essential that it be addressed. That's like basic work. And I will comment that both that the U.S. as a regional conference petitions are part of all the other legislation of those groups. So that's an essential part, because the U.S., in order to decenter the U.S., we have to give the U.S. church a place to do its work. So the voices from the central conferences have stated that their need for regionalization extends worldwide. And so I think that's an exciting thing, and I have a lot of hope for that legislation. That the second legislation I want to highlight is the work on the General Book of Discipline, which was begun in 2012. This legislation is in the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, and I will nerd out and say it's in the second volume of the ADCA on page 731. But it's a very significant legislation, and it presents us with two new sections of the discipline, Part 6 and 7, which provide for the administrative order that's essential for the whole church. And then Chapter 7, which enumerates what is adaptable. And finally, although I know I may be pressing my limit of what I'm allowed to highlight, a further important piece of legislation that's related to this is found on page 616 of the Faith and Order Committee. And that's the legislation to reauthorize the revision of paragraph 101, which is where the General Book of Discipline is coming from for the Standing Committee. This legislation would give the Standing Committee the ability to include new material in Section 6. And this is really important because it isn't possible to do the work that they're trying to do and just move words around. They need to be able to have connecting words that make the discipline make sense. So they really need support for that paragraph and that permission. So those are my highlights and hopes. Regionalization and the General Book of Discipline, and I think those pieces will move us forward.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Judy. Really, really helpful. And now, Molly, talk to us about the legislation you're paying attention to that you think will help us be the church that we dream of.
Well, if Judy was going to press her luck talking about a couple of things, I should fess up from the start that I have at least 6 paragraphs that I want to remove. I hope that we will remove from the Book of Discipline. Caleb spoke already about the statements in our social principles, and not only that statement about incompatibility, but our statements about the definition of marriage that are causing harm to queer siblings in the church and hindering the full expression of the gospel in the communities where we're located and where people are listening. But in addition, since those words were added in 1972, we have stretched that language and sentiment through different sections of the Book of Discipline in order to attempt to enforce exclusions. And there's sort of 3 main categories I put those in. One is what we've often called the funding ban, which will come to the Financial Administration Legislative Committee. This is 2 paragraphs that have restricted general church funds from being used for the promotion of homosexuality. And this has, I believe, hindered the church from resourcing itself in understanding human sexuality and the call of the gospel to be in ministry with all people. A second category of exclusions that have been in the discipline are exclusions that prevent or prosecute or ordained gay clergy. Self-avowed practicing homosexuals is the language that's in our Book of Discipline. And those paragraphs come to 2 of our legislative committees. They'll appear in Faith and Order and in Judicial Administration as they appear in our definitions of requirements for ordination and in our chargeable offenses. And a third prohibition that exists in the Book of Discipline is a prohibition against clergy who officiate same-sex unions or same-sex weddings, and also prevents them from being held in our churches. And this ban is also present in 2 legislative committees. It'll show up in ordained ministry and in judicial administration. So there's delegates listening in who are in any of these legislative committees. If you are in ordained ministry or faith and order or judicial administration, or what was the other one I said? One more. I've lost track. Financial administration.
Yes.
You get a part to play in removing these core pieces of anti-gay legislation that are part of our discipline. As we understand sort of the many reasons that we need to be fully inclusive, including LGBTQIA plus folks. The conversation in the US has shifted from when these lines were crafted in 1972 and following. And so sometimes they don't even speak to the like present state of how we understand gender identity and sexual orientation and intersectional justice issues that affect not only queer folks but other folks. But the rules that are in our book of discipline are specifically about self-avowed practicing homosexuals and same-sex weddings and union ceremonies. And it's past time to pull those out, to trust boards of ordained ministry, district committees on ordained ministry, annual conferences to make decisions and recommendations about who to ordain. They still have that responsibility and authority to see who is called and gifted and is going to be commissioned and ordained in our churches. But it's time to take out these specific prohibitions that have been exclusions, that have been a hindrance to our ministry. There are a few there's like bonus work. I'm just going to keep pressing my luck. There's bonus work that's also coming to higher education and superintendency and judicial administration, provisions that were added in the 2019 General Conference as part of what we called the traditional plan. And we can repeal those too. Although those in my mind are like a second tier, some of them become irrelevant if we take away their being a chargeable offense for a person's identity and sexuality. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Oh, God, Molly, thank you. Oh my goodness. Like, I mean, giving us not just like the pieces, but the committees that they're going to. And I think it's important to name because for some folks who have never been to a general conference or even general conference delegates who are attending for the first time, I mean, we're about to embark on 2 weeks of deep work. The first week broadly will be in legislative committees, perfecting pieces of legislation, holy conferencing in some smaller groups to really get a sense of where the body might be so that those pieces can then come to the full plenary that second week, and we'll do that collective conferencing. But I mean, for me, and I agree with every single piece of legislation that you all have lifted up. And I've got a lot of hope and heart behind the social principles, in particular, the revised social principles, because I've seen what it means to my siblings in the central conferences. I've been in spaces where my colleagues have talked about being in countries where the rights of women are not respected in those countries. And we are a part of a church that says our witness means that we have to live in a world and promote a world and champion a world that makes room and space and celebrates the contributions of all women. And so to be a part of a church that gives that kind of language to my siblings outside the United States, and this is the kind of stuff that's in our social principles. It's the kind of stuff that takes us all the way back. So Caleb, thank you for lifting it up. I'm just double clicking on what you said because I'm here for all of them. I'm definitely here for social principles. And let's keep this conversation moving. Judy, really grateful that you brought up regionalization. It's a pretty big piece. I mean, it's actually a set of proposals, right? Set of petitions, rather, around regionalization. And its impact really could, I think it really could change our church and be the beginnings of a new era of what it means to be the United Methodist Church in the world. And so I'd love for us to have a deeper conversation about regionalization specifically. I'd love for you folks here in the panel to just talk a little bit more about how you believe regionalization sort of lands for you, why you think it's important, and what maybe we should be thinking about, whether we're going to be folks on the floor of General Conference or folks who will be sitting in annual conferences who may also be needing to address these petitions around regionalization. So let me start with Judy, who got us started on this conversation. Talk to us a little bit more about regionalization, why you think it's important, what we need to know.
Yeah, well, thank you, Derek. And I thank you for highlighting that it's not just the delegates this time. I mean, that's the first hurdle, but because regionalization requires constitutional amendments, it's a double hurdle. So we have not only to pass this at General Conference, but then move on to annual conferences, and which is going to take a lot of education. I feel like delegates are starting to get the idea and the kind of an understanding of what it is, but I think we have a lot of education to do in the annual conferences, and that will be a step, providing that we are able to do this at General Conference. That will be the next hurdle that we have to do. I've dedicated a good bit of time to regionalization over the past 11 years, working alongside the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, first as the chair of the Commission on General Conference, and then later as part of as a member of the Connectional Table. So one of the things that I want to say about regionalization is it's not new, and it didn't develop suddenly after 2019, and it was not developed to make the church more inclusive, which is something that I hear a lot. There are benefits from regionalization, but that's not that isn't why it's been developed. And if you were in having conversations with some of our African delegates, you realize that that's really important to them to know that, because one of the things is really they emphasize a lot is that they really value their ability to define marriage and marriage rituals and those kinds of things. And so regionalization would open up those possibilities that we can do things differently in different places. But this regionalization was not developed because in order to accomplish that. And although we don't know exactly what will be adaptable, we know that there are things that are not going to be adaptable. They are our theological task, our Christian witness, our doctrinal standards, the Constitution, the social principles. And that's one of the reasons it's really important that those social principles be redefined now at this General Conference, and that we make the progress that we need to make, because those will be in the unadaptable portion of the Book of Discipline. We do know that now. I wanted just to highlight some of the values of regionalization. They are equity, decentering the U.S., decolonizing our mission and ministry and relationships, honoring each region's cultures and context, and centering theology and mission within the General Conference, so that the General Conference increases relevancy of our work for the entire church, and can set the mission for the entire church in that setting. So General Conference is dealing with what we need to be doing as a denomination, not the specifics of property matters or pensions or the kinds of things that need to be addressed on a regional basis. General Conference would focus on our mission and ministry, and I think that's really important. The value of regionalization is that it allows us to be contextual, and that's a benefit both to the U.S. church and also to the churches in the central conferences. Some areas of the legislation specify the specifics that will be addressed by regionalization, and they include the mission and ministry that allows for different cultural and legal systems around the world, ordination requirements for clergy, remembering that those can also be added to in the annual conferences. One of the things Molly had alluded to in terms of our boards of ordained ministry. And it would also allow regions to change chargeable offenses, and that's very significant. It's exciting to see that regionalization has received the attention it has, and I'm recognizing that those of us on this panel are all from the United States, but I've had the opportunity to travel this year in the Philippines and Africa, and delegates there are also engaged and hopeful about regionalization. So I really look forward to the possibilities that this legislation offers us.
It's awesome. So important and so helpful, Judy. And we are actually working on an episode with Central Conference Voices, because we really do want to have a full conversation as we are getting towards the church that we dream of. So thank you for that, Judy. Lonnie, want to bring you up on the stage and talk to us a little bit more. Judy covered a lot of ground, but I wonder if you've got any other thoughts about the importance of regionalization.
Just two thoughts, Derek, and I'll be brief, but I think it's critical for the church. I mean, I think the church needs to demonstrate an ability to change and become relevant to the actions of, to the aspirations of our members. And so we have a risk of folks just kind of shrugging off the general church if it can't adapt or make the changes that they hoped would come. So I think it's a critical thing. But I guess I also want to say regionalization is biblical. I think the models of the way the Bible had spread the word and how disciples were sent out on missions, and Paul's letters to early churches talked all about the different contexts and how they're responding to them. I think regionalization is the biblical church, as it were. And I think we lose, in addition, I mean, the arguments for it all are based on us becoming, adapting and changing for kind of technical reasons. But I think we can't lose the biblical character that we are aligning with. This is how Jesus worked. And so we should follow Jesus in how we do it.
Oh man, Lonnie, you took me all the way to Acts chapter 2 and Revelation 7. And I was just thinking of all of these moments where God is drawing this diversity and making us one in Christ. Just really appreciate you lifting that up. Lydia, would love to hear from you and your thoughts on regionalization and its importance.
Well, I think a word, and I agree with both Judy and Lonnie. I think one of the words that I would use is self-determination, which is a word that connects a lot of people. So, the ability to use our Wesleyan theology, right? The ability to use the quadrilateral and come up with our understanding is really important, paramount. And if we're going to do the work of decentering and decolonizing, right, our system, as Lonnie shared, self-determination is really a part of it. Now, it's also a struggle, because I think for, and I'll just name it, for us as folks from the US, it's really hard to consider the fact that we would actually be one of the regions as opposed to the central focus, right? I mean, let's be honest, we have spent the majority of our United Methodist existence being the center of these general conferences. And so what does it mean to do that, which is, again, a biblical principle? And so, how to work into living as people who honor each other's self-determination.
Oh man, Lydia, thank you. Thank you for that. I'll just say very quickly, I was able to go to Tanzania for the United Methodist Africa Forum. Judy was there as well. And it was very interesting to not be in the center of the conversation as US individuals. In fact, we were observers. So we kind of had like a little bit of voice, but no votes at all. And we watched the work. We watched the Holy Conferencing. And yeah, there was something like, oh, I want to put my hand up. Oh, I want to make a comment. And then, but there was this gift of being able to see our siblings do this work, and they don't need us. We're a part of this connection, but my African siblings were doing incredible Holy Conferencing work. And then it made me wonder, gosh, what will it be like when General Conference is in Old Mutare, Zimbabwe, and the ways that our church will be shaped by a moment like that when we are doing this work of Holy Conferencing outside the US. Okay, and I just made a whole recommendation. I will back off and go back to what we're talking about. So let's keep this conversation going. Molly, come on up and tell us your thoughts about regionalization, why it's important, what we should know about it.
Thank you so much. Sort of a Copernican revolution of our place in the universe. I think to some extent, I feel like adopting regionalization at this point is a choice about whether or not we want to continue to function as a denomination. We have gotten ourselves to a place where our structure is out of alignment with reality. And I think that's incidentally also true about our exclusionary language, particularly since 2019. The church in the US has said that we're not interested in enforcing these increasingly exclusionary, punitive policies that are aimed at throwing people out of the church. So we're not practicing them. We're not following our rules, and our structure is not like tenable. Like, it doesn't work for the church that we are. So I am enthusiastic about a proposal to regionalize because I think it's simply responsive to reality. And if we want to function as a church, this is a change that we have to make. I also want to acknowledge that we have talked about regionalization before. Judy said this already, but we passed proposals for regionalization in 2008, and then it was not ratified, in part because there were allegations made that regionalization was a coded way of being pro-gay. And it may, at that point, have been the case that passing regionalization would allow that change to happen in the US. But we're at a point now where the US has already declared with its practice that we are not interested in following exclusionary policies. And we've got separate proposals to remove this harmful anti-gay policies from our book of discipline. So these are separate issues that we can faithfully handle and move forward. Regionalization just allows us to function with values that are consistent with who we are as Christians, the kinds of things that all y'all have named, with equity, with value for all parts, not just the ones who've historically held property and capital and power in the church. This is critical for who we are. I also think that the revised social principles are a really beautiful companion to regionalization, and in some ways save us from just being an inward-looking institution. Regionalization solves institutional problems, and a revised social principles that speaks in a clear and coherent manner to our worldwide reality makes sure that what we're about is not just ordering ourselves, but proclaiming the gospel into the world and standing up for social changes that reflect the values and identity of who we are. So in a weird way, I think all of these really fit into an integral whole and have a kind of internal authority and consistency and integrity that speaks to who we're called to be in this moment and for the future.
I appreciate all of that, Molly. And it's always interesting. These pieces of legislation, they really, they kind of stand on their own. They're in this committee over here. They're talking about that thing. And also, there are these threads. There are these connections and these things that happen when we sort of begin to think about, well, when we get that piece and we also get this piece, it frees us up to do some things that we've not been able to do. So, Molly, thank you for those thoughts.
I just want to add that
Yeah.
I want to add that they're not like dependent on each other. Like, we can make any of these changes on its own, and they'll all happen concurrently. They'll all be considered concurrently during the first week by legislative committee. They don't have to happen sequentially, but I think they all speak together for a future that makes sense, is faithful, gets us closer to what Christ would want of our church.
Oh, thanks for that. Caleb, would love to hear from you as we're finishing up this part of the conversation. Talk to us about your thoughts on regionalization, why it's important.
Earlier, I was talking about decentralization of power, listening to the margins, focusing on the margins. It's an issue of justice. That's exactly what I feel regionalization is. The voices of people from the margins in our church, the central conferences, if you will, the US is the center of power, have been saying regionalization. This is the way that we go. This is what we need. So this is honoring what they're asking for. It's decolonization. It's us giving up some of our power here in the US. And I think that that is the right track to be on. I support it. I think it is essential to who we are becoming, as many of the others have said. I also know that this doesn't mean we're done with decolonization, that we're done with the conversation about being whole and fully connected with our friends and colleagues in other countries. This is the start of the work. This is a sincere, bold, prophetic move to be in a better relation with our friends. I'm here for it. Let's do this.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that, Caleb. And I think, again, it bears repeating. Yes, the regionalization is before the delegates to General Conference, but regionalization, if it passes, it will require constitutional amendments, which means that the regionalization then goes before the annual conferences. And so I often, and actually in the last several weeks, I've been saying to the laity of the Florida Conference, like, don't sleep on this. Don't just say, oh, that's just for those General Conference people. No, like, if regionalization, that the petitions of regionalization pass by 2/3 majority at General Conference, it's going to be in front of the annual conferences sooner rather than later. And so we all want to be paying attention to the intricacies as well as the ramifications of regionalization. But I also think it needs to be clear that while regionalization can be complicated, at its base, it is an opportunity for the church to give voice and equity to the whole global church, to reset the way that we organize ourselves. And somebody please feel free to correct me if I'm not saying this in the way that I should, but this gives us a chance to reset the church so that the voices of the church are able to be heard, that we're able to, in the US, deal with our stuff, and in the Congo, they can deal with their stuff, and in the Philippines, they can deal with their stuff, and Germany can deal with their stuff, and yet we can continue to do the work of the global, worldwide church in a way that moves us forward together without us having to speak to each other's context in ways that are not helpful. So I do believe that regionalization is both the direction that we need to go. I think that it is the future of our church for sure. And I actually think that it is the witness, like to what you said, Lonnie. This is the witness that the world's waiting on. And so I'm really excited about it. Okay, I'm going to move us along because we've only got so much time, friends. And there's so much legislation that we could talk about. And so we're going to talk about the one piece that I'm sure everybody watching live and watching later on, they want to hear about. They want to hear about the budget, the General Conference budget, right? Like that's the piece. And the budget isn't everything, but the budget is one piece of what it means for us to be a church together, the ways that we apportion our resources and that we then distribute those in the world, and how we do this work as United Methodists across the planet. So I'd love for us to just have a conversation really quickly about the budget that's going to be coming to General Conference. What within the budget that you've seen so far do you believe people need to be aware of? And we're going to have a lower budget. Like the budget is being reduced a great amount, which is going to impact the way that we function as a church, the things that we fund as well. So I'd love for you as leaders in the United Methodist Church in different spaces to kind of speak to any concerns that you see with the budget that will be coming before us, but maybe even the opportunities as well. And so Lonnie, would love for you to get us started with this conversation. Tell us your thoughts on the budget that's coming to GC24.
Well, I'm a conference treasurer. Conference treasurers are a tight group. We love each other and support each other and communicate a lot. So if I want to get back into that group, I've got to articulate. There's a lot of worry in the conference treasurer world around finances. Many of them are dealing with, contractions of annual conference staffs, with shifting capacity of local churches. Disaffiliations have taken huge bites out of a lot of budgets, and local churches are weaker in a lot of sense. Some haven't rebounded from the pandemic. Some saw people walk out as maybe the church didn't disaffiliate, but some families left. So I think I have to speak for them to say there's a lot of worry in the conference treasurer world around just budgets in their own, and they're dealing with contraction in their everyday, seeing friends leaving conference staff and such. So I want to say there is a level, right? And I think one shouldn't take contraction to mean to catastrophize and think it will only be the worst case scenario, right? There is a more moderate approach, a sober approach to estimating what the right level is. And there is a level at which we can work. The game isn't to think the worst case. The game is to figure out if we can get an accurate prediction. And I think there's a lot of people with a lot of experience around finances and annual conferences that, we really can get to that goal, right? And I trust in the end that things will have to change. God be with us. That's okay. We need to stay focused on what's most important and what's most effective, protect those things. And I think God is going to give, it will be sufficient. What God gives us will be sufficient for what God expects from us at this point. So I would say approach it prayerfully and carefully. But it will be different. We all know it's going to be different. It's going to be smaller. Just getting it right is the important thing.
Oh man, I appreciate you speaking from the seat of the conference treasurer. Y'all are doing incredible work, holy work for our annual conferences, and you're paying attention to the financial realities that do matter. So really, really, really grateful for that perspective, Lonnie. Judy, would love to hear from you and any thoughts you have in the particular seat that you're sitting in around our general conference budget.
Yeah, thank you. I love that Lonnie said that conference treasurers were tight. I just want to. I'm going to remember that.
Yes. I noted it as well, Judy. Yes.
Well, because of one of the responsibilities of the connectional table is to work with GCFA to present a budget to the general conference. I've spent a good bit of time discussing the budget lately. And as everyone knows, and you've just acknowledged for us, is that there's a dramatic drop in income, and that's affecting our budget. And it led to, from last year's and what was presented in the ADCA to this year, it was an additional 4.7% decrease across the budget. And then in addition, in the areas that the connectional table is dealing with, we had an additional $15 million needed for the Episcopal Fund. And that's to allow them to have enough money to do a slow rather than dramatic reduction of bishops, which is coming, but trying to balance what we could afford to pay at this point and what needed to happen in the future. That required that $15 million increase to that fund. But that means that's $15 million that's coming out of it somewhere else. So there were some ways that were suggested to make up that 15 million, but it all came at the expense of our agencies who had already experienced dramatic reductions, and that they had taken in preparation and have been taking since prior to 2016, but definitely since 2016 in preparation for reduction of the budget. And that was before we knew what would be happening with COVID and disaffiliation. So this has been continuing. And so some of that money will be made up by an increase to the base rate from the one that was originally presented to the ADCA. But I just want to emphasize that because this has the impact on the conference budgets, that's a decrease from the 2016 base rate. So the overall budget will be significantly lower for 2024 over what it was 2016. And one thing I just really feel like I need to say about the budget from the CT perspective is that we have used a values-based budget that considers missional priorities as well as justice and fairness and equity in our considerations of the budget. And for that reason, the small agencies and commissions that have a smaller budget and smaller reserves and are more greatly dependent on apportioned funds, they're considered separately in the allocation so that they don't, because they couldn't sustain the kinds of 47, 52% cuts that are happening across the board. So that this approach has been affirmed repeatedly by the connectional table. And I know that this was highlighted in the latest presentation I saw from GCFA, that they mentioned that they kind of singled that out. But I just wanted to mention that this was an intentional decision by the CT based on our values budget. And I think that's an important consideration.
Judy, thank you for all of that detail. It's so important to even understand sort of the thinking behind certain ways that we have budgeted historically, and those ways that may continue to guide our thinking around the budget going forward. So thank you so much for that. Molly, would love to bring you up on stage now and just hear in some of your thoughts around the General Conference budget.
Yeah, thank you. I've been thinking a lot about the budget in this season of a smaller church, acknowledging that disaffiliations and sort of the same sort of institutional decline we've seen culturally over decades, that was accelerated by pandemic, is all very real. And I see this as a critical moment as a general conference to make sure that we tend to the institutional questions we need to tend to if we want to have a future. So instead of talking about what specifically this budget is going to enable and what might be lost from the spending levels we've been able to set in the past that fund our mission, I want to acknowledge that if we don't approve a regionalized church structure, if we don't remove harmful anti-gay exclusions in our book of discipline, we run the risk of continuing to fracture and fall apart as an institution. And I hear and appreciate the fear that sometimes gets named when it comes up to any sort of additional change, like we've lost so much, we don't want to lose anyone else. But I see the clear danger of continuing as an institution where our practice is out of alignment with our rule book, where we have adopted increasingly punitive prohibitions on gay clergy, on same-sex weddings, and at the same time committed to not practicing that exclusion together, to not punish them. There's this like pull apart of the integrity of the institution because we're not willing to practice what we say in our rule book. And it's on limited issues now, but it runs the risk of sort of unraveling more. And it's not, I don't mean this as a like threat of we're going to cut funding to things, but to acknowledge that there is this pulling away of trust in the institution, a falling away of the role of the sort of institutional mainline church in our broader culture. And that gets accelerated when we're not in even alignment with ourselves and we don't have that kind of integrity. So this is a critical moment to make the changes that line back up our practice, our experience of God, our understanding of theology, our appreciation for how to function as an institution marked by the grace of Jesus Christ, and how we order ourselves if we want to have a budget that enables these things that we value. I'm so proud of the ways that our denomination enables missional work and witness for social justice and educational materials that help us learn, help us our worship life be rich. All of these things that enable bishops to help do the work of superintending our ministry. All of these things require us to trust in the institution and to believe that it can be a part of the change. And so this is a time when all of that action matters if we're going to have a future that is has capacity for hope. It's a change that we need to make sure we're holding these things together and not become captive to fear of more change, but instead be able to step back and look at who we are and the values that were shaped by the call of the gospel and make the changes we need to as an institution.
Oh, such important clarity there. Thank you, Molly. Caleb, want to get your thoughts in here on the budget as well.
Yes, I am. I'm the finance chair of my church, Duke Memorial. And it took me well over a year to get comfortable with that budget, which is under $1 million, right? And it's complicated, and I'm learning more things every time we have a finance meeting where something happens. When you talk about this budget, I'm just not prepared. I am underprepared for this kind of conversation at General Conference. And I don't think that I'm the only delegate that's going to be in the room that feels like this is absolutely overwhelming to understand what's going on in our budget. There's a history there. There's a lot of work that's gone into it. There are conversations that I will never know about of people who have made good decisions or sometimes not. And I want to be better prepared for these conversations. It's my hope that, and especially in a time when we see how these conversations about reductions in budgets, I want to be prepared because I want to make sure that our funding is in alignment with our mission and our vision. And I don't exactly know how to do that just yet. What do I need to be voting on? So on behalf of new delegates, people who are not used to or not comfortable with looking at the general conference budget for an entire quadrennium or whatever the next term is going to be, that's something that I really do hope we are able to do well before we start on the 22nd of April.
Thank you for naming that, Caleb, because there are a ton of new General Conference delegates, folks who will be stepping on that floor for the first time. And I think it's helpful that you've named it, that some of us don't know even like where to begin in looking at the general budget. And that's where we've got to lean in on our colleagues and asking about that history and not being afraid to ask the question in delegations and even ask the questions on the plenary floor. Okay, what does it mean if we reduce the budget to this line item to this, and to not be afraid to ask those questions. So Caleb, thank you for that. And Lydia, I'd love for you to sort of finish us up with this part of the conversation. Any thoughts you've got on the General Conference budget?
Well, okay, so I have to say, that I actually believe that the biggest place of contention that we might experience at General Conference will be the budget. And so Caleb, get ready. So because so here's, I often tell people this, follow the political landscape of the global connection, right? Or just the political landscape of the world, right? And listen to the conversations, the political conversations, right? We're doing this at a microcosm of what's happening around the world, right? And so what happens around the world is people are wrestling with inflation, with budgets, with all kinds of things. And what do we do it's like the Lord of the Flies, right? And we devour each other, right? So this is the potential of what could happen, right? And I've always learned, I had a great Methodist pastor who was my pastor, called me into ministry and would say, your budget, show me your budget and I'll tell you about your missiology, right? Your budget speaks to your missiology speaks about your Christology, right? So who Christ is based on what your mission is, and your mission is based on what you put aside, your budget, right? To create. So, I think it's really important that we're lifting that up, and that as delegates, just to be aware, once this is, as we look at the budget and we analyze the budget, we're thinking from a mindset of, again, the question that I asked at the very beginning, where does it hurt? And if we're asking where does it hurt, how do the people that hurt the most have the most agency to speak to the budget that we create? How does that work, right? So, UMCOR does this when they go into disaster relief stuff. They create a team out of the people that have been affected the most. I think that's a beautiful model for what we have experienced as a denomination through disaffiliation. Why not ask the people that have been affected the most of how this budget speaks life to them, or how do we work the fact that, yeah, we're all struggling with less money, we're trying to do more with less money. So those things, so those to me are really big questions. I think that we should be prepared that this is where we're going to spend some significant time on this, and it happens to be like the last day, something like that, or second to the last day, right? And so
Yeah,
we don't
yeah.
get time to really, which is another thing. Oh, and by the way, okay, I'm gonna say this. I wonder if it's time for us to ask a serious question around the role of the episcopacy, because we spend a whole lot of money on that. And I believe that the worker is worthy of their pay, as Scripture says. But in this season of reimagination, and the possibility of what that committee might look like, that is looking at a different structure, is the role of the episcopacy, is it functioning in a way that's efficient for this new iteration of the church? And do we need to think about, I know I'm gonna get a call tomorrow, but it's okay.
But Lydia, I so appreciate you bringing that up, because again, like, if we go to General Conference trying to avoid the real conversations, that not asking the question, where does it hurt? Not asking the question of who's most affected by these decisions that are made. Like, if we don't do that, we're not going to do our work. And so, yes, when you brought it up, I was like, ooh, and that to me was a signal. Yes, that's a conversation that we need to have, in conversation with our Episcopal leaders, for sure, right? In conversation with clergy who may want to one day be Episcopal leaders, in conversation with laity who have to go back to congregations, like Caleb, and like help us understand why we're going to continue to pay apportionments, right? But that's a part of the conversation. And so just really grateful for you lifting it up, and grateful for all of you. Talking about legislation is not always the most exciting thing for those of us who are not Metho nerds. The Metho nerds, though, were like, this has been awesome. But, at the end of the day, the things that get put into the book of discipline, the things that we amend, the pieces that we add, and that we take away, all of that speaks to who we are as the church. It's not the only thing that speaks to who we are as a church, but these organizing documents, these documents that describe our life together as United Methodists, it matters. And so this conversation has mattered tonight, and the work that we get to do as General Conference delegates, as well as those who will be attending annual conferences as well. This work, this legislative work, it really matters, and it really does require an all play. It is not just for the Metho nerds. It's not just for the clergy, okay? Like, let me say that out loud. It's not just for the folks who feel like they're nerdy and have all of the intellectual power, but literally we need everybody at the table talking about how we organize ourselves as a church. And so I just really, really grateful for this time. We're coming close to the end. In fact, we might be just a little bit over. So I'm going to ask one more question of everyone tonight. And again, just recognizing that while legislation is not always the most exciting thing to talk about, it's really important. And I do think that at times legislation might be pointing us to the church that we dream of. And so my question for the panel is this, and Molly, I'm going to start with you. Are there any points of hope that you see from this conversation about legislation, the pieces of legislation that we're looking at? Are there any points of hope that you see getting us to the church that we dream of, specifically as we think about the legislation at General Conference?
I always see hope. And I have this vivid memory of General Conference in 2008, after we took a vote and in which we determined to hold on to the exclusionary language in our social principles about incompatibility. And in the minutes after that, we were like stuck there listening to a report, and someone up in the top of the stands of the convention hall that we were in started singing Jesus Loves Me. And literally from the margins, this affirmation of the gospel came and filled the room for those, I don't know, 10 minutes as we waited for our lunchtime adjournment. I have such deep confidence in the power of the Holy Spirit to keep working with us, whatever we do, that grounds me in hope and keeps me moving onward. I have seen the faithful work and witness and ministry of queer leaders in our midst. I have seen the gift of same-sex marriages in the communities that I've served and families that I've known, in faithful laity who speak up for justice and inclusion. I have a sense that we're at a moment as a church where we're ready to clarify in our book of discipline that we are not defined by exclusions, but by an appreciation for this expansive and inclusive grace that comes before all of us. I have been reflecting over these last several months about how this general conference will be different from any one in the past. It's been such a long time since we gathered for a regular general conference, and there has been the kind of transition that always happens. People are no longer with us who have been with us, both because they're now of blessed memory and because people have left the church unable to stay any longer in an institution that refuses to affirm their dignity and worth. And I'm sometimes find myself with just such heavy grief from those losses. But I'm also aware that this is the first general conference we're coming to where we have an organized queer delegate caucus. I'm so glad Caleb is a part of this conversation and a convener of that group. That is a powerful witness to the fact that our annual conferences across the US have affirmed that a person's sexuality or gender identity is not an obstacle to their participation, our celebration of them in the church, our trusting of them of leadership. And I think that's a real shift. I think we're ready to finally remove this harmful language. We have 2 out gay bishops who will be sitting on the dais during general conference. That's never been the case at a regular general conference. We're moving on, and it's a moment where the church can catch up to what the Holy Spirit's doing in our midst. And these changes that we have are simply deletions. There'll be work yet to do, but I think we're ready to finally say this is not how we're going to be defined and marked, and that there's a widespread consensus about this, a readiness to move forward, a clarity, having come through all that we've come through in these last many years, about what it means to respond to the grace of God. And one last word is that we've got Jesus. And I don't mean that in a flip way. Like, we're a church that continues to be reshaped in confession of where we have done wrong, where we continue to do harm, trusting in the power of grace and forgiveness to be working with us as we become the church that we're called to be, that will not let us go and that will not leave us as we've been, but will always move us forward for the sake of love. That's where I'm finding hope today.
Oh, Molly, thank you for all of that. So, so good. Lydia, as we think about the legislation coming before General Conference, are you seeing any points, any signs of hope in the legislation and what it might do to get us to be that church we dream of?
So I find that the legislations that are that push us to ask the difficult questions, right? To push us to make us uncomfortable. I actually find hope in that, because at least we are as a church, we are willing to have those conversations, as opposed to, I grew up in a very fundamentalist denomination. And so, I mean, the thought of even asking those questions wouldn't even be like, it wouldn't even appear on the radar, right? And so now I'm in this space where, and so to me, this is really corny, but Mr. Rogers used to say, whatever is mentionable, right, is workable. So if we keep speaking into it and keep like wrestling with it, I think there's hope. We say in Spanish, en la lucha hay vida. In the struggle, there's life. So yeah, that's where I see hope.
Oh, that's so inspiring, Lydia, and getting some Mr. Rogers up in here too. Oh man, so good. Caleb, as we think about the legislation before GC, any signs of hope you're seeing in the church that we dream of?
It's not necessarily the legislation, but the legislators, right? I think it's who is in the room this time then that was not in 2016 or even 2019. Look at this slate of delegates from the US in particular that was empowered, affirmed, and brought to be in the room. So that's what gives me hope. I mean, I've got a meeting after this with the Career Delegate Caucus. There are over 60 of us who were elected from across the 5 different jurisdictions. 26 of those are us on the floor voting at General Conference. I think that is a hugely powerful statement in itself, along with 2 queer bishops on the dais. What a moment. I just got a text from a friend of mine who is a young queer woman, 2 years out of div school, who was just, she's now being nominated to be a provisional elder, right? Like there's a transgender friend of mine who is a div school graduate who is finally saying, I want to pursue this route. I feel like I can do this. Depends on what happens at General Conference. Like that is what gives me a sense of hope, that there is something so much bigger than that incompatibility clause that has ruled over my sense of self in this church and how this church viewed us. There's so much more here. And yes, it's in some nuance and details of legislation. And yes, there's going to be voting and buttons and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, I think that we will have celebration to be had. And that's why I'm here. That's why I think we're all here. And I'm here for it. Let's see what happens.
Love it, Caleb. Oh, thank you for that. So good. Judy, any signs of hope that you're seeing getting us to the church that we dream of?
Yeah, I'm excited for the possibility of new life in the United Methodist Church. I think regionalization has the possibility to bring that new life to our structure. Then we live into that. This will be my 6th General Conference. And I have experienced a lot of highs and lows. And I have to admit that tonight is a high, and just listening to the hope that's in this room and then that we've experienced here in this small community. And I appreciate that so much. And people keep asking me, what's General Conference going to be like? What's it going to be like in Charlotte? And I keep telling them it depends on how we show up. If it is my prayer that that those who show up are excited about the UMC that's moving ahead, and that we're looking for new possibilities for our beloved denomination, and that's my prayer. That's my hope that's where we will be when we're there, and that we will feel this just spirit moving among us in a way that I haven't experienced at General Conference before. I mean, there are moments. Every General Conference has its moments, but I'm just that's my hope, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you for that, Judy, and for serving so many years at General Conference and still being here for it. I love it. Lonnie, round us out here. Any signs of hope that you're seeing as we reflect on the legislation and the church that we dream of?
Well, let me start, Derek, thanking you for your facilitation of all of this. You bring such energy and optimism to it. Your spirit is infectious and delightful. So thank you so much for what you did. I think I'm going to pick up where Caleb laid it down, and I have a lot of hope in this cohort of delegates. They are ready for change. They are not stuck in the old patterns, but they're not disruptors that destroy, but disruptors that can rebuild. And they slow it down and say, what are we really doing here? And so I think I have a lot of hope in the capacity of this cohort of delegates to be about reframing who we are as a United Methodist witness to a broken world, who we are to each other, who we can be in supporting each other in becoming more faithful disciples of Jesus Christ. I think if there's delegates on the call, I think it's imperative as soon as you get to Charlotte, make a friend from the central conferences. I mean, knitting those relationships into the fabric that we've been working on is going to be critical for us to move together in a way that hears all the voices and listens carefully to what the needs are and passions are. I think that's an opportunity before us. And I know it's my hobby horse, but I'm coming back to the 21st Century Church petition. I think this cohort, more than any other, really can handle a 2026 special session in a way that innovates and reformats and finds a way to change the denomination so we embrace God's promise for us. I think God's not done with this church. I know that. And we can listen and move and find it. And so let us innovate together. Let us be bold together. Let us listen carefully to each other. Let us fall in relationship and be dynamic and creative and craft a bright future.
Y'all, I just want to thank you so much for this incredible conversation that really was hopeful and energetic around legislation. So Lonnie and Lydia, Caleb, Judy, and Molly, thank you, thank you, thank you. This was such a great, great conversation today around the legislation that gets us to the church we dream of. Cynthia, if you want to come back onto the stage, and we'll begin to close. Again, thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation, this roundtable episode.
Thanks
So
to our
fun.
panelists tonight. And Derek, what an amazing conversation. Thoughtful, lively, so helpful with ins and outs and details about General Conference, as well as just the depth of experience and understanding, and just wonderfully articulate and helpful language tonight for us. So I want to thank the panelists. And I want to thank you, Derek, for moderating the discussion and also offering your insights as a lay delegate yourself and as a leader in our church. Thank you for all that you bring to this as well. And thank you to those of us who joined us this evening for this wonderful and helpful and insightful conversation. We hope you'll join us for our next roundtable. It will be on Saturday, April 6th at 10 a.m. It is going to be the Church We Dream of, Voices from the Central Conferences. And we're doing this on a Saturday morning in order to accommodate time zones that are so necessary when doing a conversation with people from all over the world. We hope you'll join us for that day and be on the lookout for more information.
Awesome. Cynthia, thank you so much. Love just being in this work with you. And again, thanks to all of those who watched, whether you were watching live or watching the recording. So friends, you be blessed. Have a great evening, and we'll see you again soon. Be well.
Thanks all.